Hi guys, close your eyes for a little while, and allow the noise of the present day to drift quietly into the distance. There is nowhere you need to hurry. Nothing asks for your attention. The air becomes still, and somewhere beyond the reach of memory, another world begins to wake beneath a pale morning sky. Long before the great temples stood complete beneath the blazing sun, before stories of mighty rulers traveled across distant lands, there were ordinary people beginning another ordinary day. The world around them was simple in many ways, yet full of quiet work that never seemed to end. Every loaf of bread, every basket woven from reeds, every stone carried across warm sand, every field planted beside the river slowly became part of something much larger than any single person could ever see. Tonight, we leave behind the names carved deeply into monuments. Instead, we follow the gentle footsteps of the countless men, women, and children whose names have long disappeared into the soft dust of time. The first light of morning arrives slowly across the Nile. Mist hangs low above the quiet water. The river hardly seems to move at all. It reflects soft colors from the sky, turning silver, then pale blue, and finally warm gold as the sun climbs little by little toward the horizon. Along the muddy banks, tall reeds sway gently in the faint breeze. Birds begin calling across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a fisherman pushes his small wooden boat away from shore using a long pole. The movement is slow and practiced. He has done this nearly every morning of his life. The coolness of dawn will not last very long. Soon the heat will settle across the valley, wrapping itself around every field, every village, every workshop, and every dusty road. Everyone knows this. It is simply part of life. The village begins waking one home at a time. The homes are built from mud bricks shaped by hand months or years before. Their thick walls help keep out some of the afternoon heat, though they cannot stop it entirely. Flat roofs wait quietly above narrow rooms where families have slept close together through the night. Inside one small house, a mother is already awake. She rises before anyone else. Her feet touch the cool packed earth floor. She moves carefully so she does not wake the youngest child sleeping nearby beneath a woven linen cloth. Outside, the village remains peaceful. Only a few voices float gently through the morning air. She steps into the courtyard carrying a clay jar. The water inside is cool from the night. She pours a little into another vessel before preparing grain that had been ground the evening before. The work begins almost silently. Nothing about it is hurried. She has repeated these same movements for years. Her hands know where everything belongs without needing to think. Nearby, another woman kneels beside a stone grinding slab. She places handfuls of grain beneath the heavy grinding stone and begins pushing it forward. Then back. Forward again. Back again. The steady sound joins many others beginning across the village. Stone against stone. Soft scraping. Gentle breathing. The quiet rhythm almost feels like another heartbeat spreading from house to house. Before long, the smell of fresh flour begins mixing with the cool morning air. Soon fires are lit. Thin streams of smoke rise slowly above flat rooftops before disappearing into the brightening sky. Small clay ovens begin warming. The smell of baking bread follows. It is a simple smell. Warm. Comforting. Familiar. Nearly every family begins the day with bread. Not because it is special, but because it is dependable. Grain has become one of the quiet foundations of Egyptian life. It demands endless labor before reaching the table. Fields must be planted. Water carefully managed. Harvests gathered beneath the hot sun. Bundles carried. Grain dried. Stored. Ground. Mixed. shaped, baked. Every loaf contains many days of work. Perhaps this is why no crumb is wasted. Outside the village, the fields stretch toward the river. Farmers are already walking narrow paths between irrigation channels. Many carry simple wooden tools balanced across their shoulders. Some lead oxen with slow, patient steps. Others carry woven baskets filled with seeds. Their sandals leave faint marks in the soft earth before disappearing beneath countless footsteps that will follow throughout the day. No one speaks very loudly. Morning has its own quiet language. A nod. A smile. A few soft greetings. The work itself says the rest. The Nile has always decided much about life here. Its yearly floods leave behind rich dark soil unlike the dry desert beyond the valley. People have learned to watch its moods with careful attention. Too much water can destroy. Too little can leave fields thirsty. Each season brings different tasks. Planting, growing, harvesting, repairing canals, preparing again. The cycle never truly ends. For one young farmer, this is only his second year working beside his father. His shoulders are still growing stronger. His hands already carry small rough patches where smooth skin has slowly become calloused. He watches carefully. His father wastes very few words. Instead, lessons are shown through movement. How deeply to press seeds into moist earth. How to judge whether water is flowing evenly. How to notice small changes in the color of leaves. These quiet skills cannot be learned quickly. They are gathered little by little across many seasons. Farther along the river, fishermen pull woven nets from shallow water. The ropes feel rough against tired hands. Sometimes the nets are heavy. Sometimes disappointingly light. No morning is exactly the same. The river gives generously, but never promises anything. Small fish flash silver beneath the rising sunlight before disappearing into baskets lined with damp reeds. The fishermen speak softly as they work. They know the river well enough that loud voices seem unnecessary. Every ripple carries familiar meaning. Every changing current tells its own story. Behind them, children begin arriving near the shoreline. Some help carry baskets. Others simply watch with curious eyes. Their days will gradually become filled with responsibilities, but for now they still find wonder in nearly everything. A dragonfly lands upon a reed. One child follows it with careful attention until it suddenly lifts back into the air. Simple moments like these pass quietly through every generation. They are rarely recorded. No scribe writes about them. No monument celebrates them. Yet they form much of what life truly feels like. As the morning grows brighter, more people appear along the dusty roads connecting nearby villages. A merchant guides two donkeys carrying baskets filled with onions, dried fish, woven cloth, and small pottery jars. The animals walk patiently beneath their loads. They know these roads almost as well as the merchant himself. Dust rises gently around their feet. It settles again almost immediately. The merchant greets familiar faces along the way. Perhaps he traded with them only a week before. Perhaps he has known their families for many years. Trust grows slowly in places like these. People remember fairness. They remember kindness. They also remember broken promises. Commerce is not simply about goods. It is about relationships carefully built across seasons. By now, sunlight reaches the rooftops. The coolness has begun slipping away. Inside workshops, another kind of day quietly unfolds. Potters shape wet clay upon simple wheels. Their hands move with remarkable patience. The clay responds to every small touch. A little pressure changes everything. Too much force can ruin hours of preparation. The potter understands this well. He works steadily, never rushing. His fingers glide upward as a water jar slowly rises from a spinning mound of earth. Nearby, finished vessels wait in neat rows. Some will carry grain. Others hold water. Some store oil. Others may eventually rest inside homes that have not yet been built. Every object begins with ordinary hands. The same is true for carpenters. They smooth rough pieces of wood beneath bronze tools that must themselves be sharpened often. The scent of fresh-cut timber briefly fills the workshop before drifting outside into warm air. Hammering remains gentle, measured, rhythmic, almost peaceful. Even labor has its own quiet music. As the sun climbs higher, the village becomes fully awake. Life settles into familiar routines that have changed very little across generations. Some people sweep courtyards. Others repair walls cracked by heat. Children carry water jars that seem almost too large for their small arms. Goats wander between homes. Dogs stretch lazily in patches of morning sunlight. Old neighbors sit together beneath precious shade, speaking slowly about crops, weather, and family. No one knows they are living inside a civilization that future ages will call extraordinary. To them, this is simply another day. And another day. And another. That is how great civilizations are truly built. Not only by kings. Not only by monuments. But by mornings that begin before sunrise, by tired hands that never stop working, by bread shared around quiet family meals, and by countless ordinary people who continue doing what yesterday required, and what tomorrow will ask once again. The heat continues to grow. The village breathes slowly beneath the widening sky. And somewhere beyond the fields, another worker begins walking toward a construction site where enormous stones wait patiently beneath the morning sun. The young builder walked with many others along a dusty path that had already been shaped by thousands of footsteps. His sandals pressed softly into the warm earth, leaving faint marks that would soon disappear beneath the steady stream of workers following behind him. The morning was still young enough that the air carried a trace of coolness, but everyone knew the warmth would not wait much longer. He carried only what he needed. A small bundle of food wrapped in linen. A clay jar filled with water. A simple wooden mallet resting across one shoulder. Nothing about his appearance would have seemed remarkable. If someone had passed him on the road, they might have remembered only another quiet worker beginning another ordinary day. Around him, conversations drifted gently through the still air. One man spoke about repairing his roof before the next season arrived. Another wondered whether the river would rise as expected. Someone else laughed softly after remembering something a child had said the evening before. The laughter did not last long. It faded naturally into the rhythm of walking. Soon the construction grounds appeared beyond a low rise. From far away, the place looked peaceful. Large blocks of pale limestone rested neatly in rows. Wooden sledges waited where they had been left the previous afternoon. Thick ropes lay coiled upon the ground. Wooden levers leaned against unfinished walls that slowly reached higher with each passing season. Nothing here moved quickly. The work was far too heavy for haste. Instead, everything depended upon patience. Groups of laborers gathered together beneath the direction of experienced foremen who had spent many years learning how to organize dozens of people into one steady rhythm. Each person understood a small part of the larger task. No one worker could complete the work alone. Many hands made every stone move. The first sounds of labor rose quietly into the morning. Ropes tightened. Wood creaked. Stone scraped softly across damp earth prepared to reduce friction. Voices called simple instructions. Not loud. Not angry. Only clear enough for everyone to hear. Together. Slowly. Again. The stone moved another few inches. Then another. Progress was measured not by great leaps, but by patient effort repeated hundreds of times. Nearby, another group carefully shaped rough stone into smooth blocks. Bronze chisels tapped against limestone with steady precision. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Small pieces fell away. Dust settled across feet, arms, and faces until everyone carried the pale color of the stone itself. The workers hardly noticed anymore. Dust had become part of daily life. It settled into their hair. It rested beneath their fingernails. It clung to their simple linen clothing. At the end of each day they would wash what they could beside the river, though some traces always remained. Not far away, a young apprentice watched an older stonemason at work. The master said very little. His lessons came through careful demonstration. He showed how to hold the chisel at just the right angle. How to strike firmly without striking too hard. How to listen to the sound each blow made against the stone. A clean sound often meant the cut was true. A dull sound suggested something else. The apprentice listened with his eyes as much as his ears. Skills like these could not be hurried. Years shaped craftsmen just as craftsmen shaped stone. Above them the sun continued its slow climb. Shadows became shorter. The light grew brighter. Heat settled across the worksite like a heavy blanket. Men paused often to drink from clay jars. Water had warmed already, yet it still brought welcome relief. Some wiped sweat from their foreheads with rough linen cloths. Others simply stood quietly for a moment before returning to their tasks. No one expected comfort. The heat belonged to the land as surely as the river itself. Across the valley, women continued working inside shaded courtyards. One carefully kneaded dough inside a large clay bowl. She folded it gently with practiced hands until it became smooth and soft. Nearby, another woman prepared onions, beans, and herbs gathered earlier that morning. The meal would be simple. Bread. Vegetables. Perhaps a little fish if fortune had smiled upon the fishermen before sunrise. Simple food carried surprising importance. It restored tired muscles. It brought families together. It marked the quiet beginning and ending of each day. The smell of baking drifted through narrow streets between mud-brick homes. Smoke rose lazily into the bright sky. Children followed the scent with hungry smiles. Some carried small baskets. Others balanced water jars with careful concentration. Even at a young age, everyone slowly learned how daily life depended upon many small responsibilities. Older sisters watched younger brothers. Grandparents sat beneath shaded walls twisting fibers into rope. Their fingers moved steadily despite their age. They no longer lifted heavy stones or worked long hours in the fields, but their hands still found useful work. Nothing was wasted. Not time. Not skill. Not even short moments during the hottest hours. In another corner of the village, a scribe settled comfortably upon a woven reed mat. His writing palette rested beside him. Thin reed pens waited carefully arranged. A small amount of black ink sat within one shallow compartment. Red ink rested nearby for special markings. Before him lay fresh sheets of papyrus. He dipped the pen lightly before beginning today's records. Grain deliveries. Worker attendance. Supplies received. Supplies distributed. Numbers filled many lines. Names followed quietly behind them. The work demanded patience rather than strength. His shoulders would not ache from carrying stone, but his eyes often grew tired after long hours of careful attention. Mistakes could cause confusion later. So every symbol deserved calm concentration. The scribe occasionally lifted his eyes toward the busy courtyard outside. He watched laborers passing with baskets upon their shoulders. He noticed merchants leading donkeys loaded with goods. He heard distant hammering carried gently through warm air. Then he lowered his gaze once more and continued writing. The rhythm suited him. Outside the village, the fields shimmered beneath growing heat. Farmers worked steadily despite the rising temperature. Some cleared weeds growing between young crops. Others repaired irrigation channels where small sections had collapsed. Water moved quietly through carefully dug pathways, bringing life wherever it flowed. Every channel mattered. A small blockage could leave part of a field dry while another received too much. So farmers watched constantly. They noticed details many visitors would overlook. The color of damp soil. The movement of tiny insects. The shape of young leaves reaching toward sunlight. These quiet observations came from lifetimes spent close to the earth. Near the riverbank, fishermen returned from deeper water. Their boats drifted gently toward shore. Some baskets held enough fish to satisfy several families. Others contained only a modest catch. No one could command the river. It offered what it wished. The fishermen accepted both generous mornings and quiet ones with equal patience. As they unloaded their baskets, cats appeared almost silently from shaded corners. They watched every movement with bright, careful eyes. The fishermen smiled. Sometimes a small fish found its way toward waiting paws. Sometimes it did not. Still, the cats returned each day, hopeful and unhurried. By midday, nearly every patch of shade had become precious. Palm trees cast narrow shadows across courtyards. Canvas coverings stretched above busy workshops. Workers rested briefly where they could. Some sat together sharing bread and onions. Others leaned quietly against mudbrick walls. Conversations became softer. The heat seemed to slow even the voices. A warm breeze wandered through the village carrying many familiar scents: fresh bread, clay drying beneath the sun, wood shavings scattered across workshop floors, river water, warm reeds, smoke from cooking fires, dust resting upon stone. Each scent belonged naturally to the world around it. None demanded attention. Together they formed the quiet fragrance of everyday Egyptian life. The afternoon stretched gently ahead, bringing with it more work, more patient hands, and more ordinary moments that would quietly become part of the endless rhythm beside the timeless Nile. The afternoon unfolded without urgency. The sun rested high above the valley, filling every open space with bright white light. The shadows beneath walls and trees became small, offering only narrow places where people could escape the strongest heat. The air itself seemed to move more slowly now. Even the birds grew quieter during these hottest hours. Most of the village continued its work with calm determination. There was no expectation that the heat would become easier. Instead, people learned to move with it. Heavy labor slowed just enough to preserve strength. Conversations became softer. Every sip of water was taken carefully, never wasted. The rhythm of the day adjusted itself almost naturally, just as it had through countless summers before. Along one dusty road, a line of donkeys approached from a neighboring settlement. Their hooves produced a gentle, steady sound against the packed earth. Step after step. Without hurry. Bundles of flax hung from their backs beside woven baskets filled with dried dates, onions, pottery, and carefully folded linen cloth. A merchant walked beside them with relaxed shoulders, his face shaded by a simple linen covering wrapped loosely around his head. He knew nearly every bend in the road. He knew which villages welcomed travelers with fresh water. He knew where children often gathered to watch the caravans arrive. He even recognized certain trees that had stood beside the path since his own childhood. Travel was never simply movement from one place to another. It became a collection of familiar sights that slowly marked the passing years. As he entered the village, several people greeted him with quiet smiles. No loud marketplace suddenly appeared. Trade happened gradually. Neighbors examined pottery one piece at a time. A woman felt the smooth surface of a storage jar before nodding with quiet approval. Another compared two woven baskets, testing their strength with gentle hands. Small exchanges took place beneath the afternoon sun. Grain for cloth. Oil for dried fish. Pottery for fresh vegetables. These simple trades connected villages along the Nile just as surely as the river itself. Nearby, children watched with wide eyes. The merchant always carried objects from places they had never seen. Different styles of pottery. Strange pieces of wood washed down the river from distant lands. Colorful stones polished smooth by flowing water. To adults these were useful goods. To children they were tiny windows into a much larger world. One little boy reached carefully toward a polished shell resting inside a basket. The merchant noticed. Instead of pulling it away, he picked it up and placed it gently into the child's hand. The shell felt cool despite the heat surrounding them. Its smooth curves caught the sunlight in quiet ways. The boy turned it over again and again, wondering where the river had carried it from before it arrived here. A few moments later, he returned it with both hands. The merchant smiled warmly. No words were needed. Across the village, inside a shaded weaving workshop, women sat side by side before upright wooden looms. Their fingers moved with remarkable patience. One thread crossed another. Then another. The steady pattern continued almost endlessly. The quiet tapping of wooden tools blended with the gentle rustling of linen fibers. Every length of cloth required many hours. There were no shortcuts. Each thread depended upon the one before it. Some cloth would become simple clothing for everyday use. Some would wrap precious household goods. Some would eventually travel far beyond this village through networks of merchants following the Nile. The weavers rarely thought about where every finished piece might go. Their attention remained fixed upon the work directly before them. One careful thread at a time. A grandmother worked among them. Her hands showed many signs of age. The skin had become thin. Small lines crossed every finger. Yet her movements remained wonderfully steady. She had woven linen for longer than some of the younger women had been alive. Occasionally one of them paused to ask a quiet question. Without stopping her own work, the older woman offered gentle advice. Not as instruction. Simply as shared experience. She knew how tightly to pull each thread. She knew how changing humidity could affect the fibers. She knew which small mistakes could be corrected and which ones could not. Knowledge often moved through villages like this without being written down. It passed from patient hands to patient hands. The afternoon breeze wandered softly through the doorway. It carried with it the smell of sun-warmed earth and distant river water. For just a moment, everyone paused to enjoy the moving air before returning once more to their weaving. Not far away, inside another courtyard, two young girls helped prepare the evening meal. One rinsed vegetables in cool water drawn earlier that morning. The other gathered herbs growing in small patches beside the house. Their mother mixed grain into fresh dough while speaking gently about the tasks waiting tomorrow. There was comfort in familiar routines. The same work returned each day. The same meals. The same careful cleaning. The same preparation for another sunrise. Some might imagine such repetition becoming tiresome. Yet repetition also brought a quiet sense of security. People knew what tomorrow would ask of them. The rhythm of life remained dependable. As long as the river continued its faithful journey northward, there would always be fields to tend, bread to bake, nets to mend, and homes to care for. In another part of the settlement, an elderly man rested beneath the shade of a sycamore fig tree. He no longer possessed the strength to labor from dawn until dusk. Many years of lifting stone and digging canals had slowly worn his body. His back bent more than it once had. His knees reminded him of every season they had carried him across the fields. Yet he remained surrounded by purpose. His grandchildren sat nearby listening quietly as he repaired a fishing net. The work required sharp eyes more than strong muscles. He found tiny breaks where the cords had frayed. One by one he tied careful knots. The children watched every movement. Occasionally they tried copying him using smaller pieces of cord. Their knots were uneven. Some slipped loose almost immediately. The old man smiled gently and showed them again. There was no frustration in his voice. Only patience. He understood that every skilled hand had once been uncertain. The afternoon sunlight slowly changed. Without anyone truly noticing, it softened just a little. The brightest white became warmer. The long hours of heat had begun their quiet journey toward evening. At the construction site, laborers sensed the change before they could fully see it. The worst heat had passed. Shoulders straightened. The pace became slightly stronger once more. Large stones continued their patient movement across wooden sledges. Teams worked together with practiced coordination. Every pull happened at nearly the same moment. Every pause allowed tired muscles a brief rest. The foreman rarely shouted. Most instructions were already understood. These men had worked beside one another through many seasons. They recognized each other's breathing, each other's footsteps, each other's strengths. When one laborer grew tired, another quietly shifted a little more weight onto his own shoulders. Such kindness often passed unnoticed. No records described it. No monument celebrated it. Yet it helped raise every wall. Near the edge of the worksite, water carriers moved steadily among the workers. Large clay jars rested upon wooden frames balanced across their shoulders. Whenever someone paused for a drink, cool water was poured carefully into waiting hands or small cups. No drop was spilled carelessly. Water was life. Its value needed no explanation. The builders thanked the carriers with simple nods before returning once again to the slow work of shaping history without ever imagining how distant generations would admire the finished stones. To them, tomorrow looked very much like today. Another sunrise. Another meal before dawn. Another walk along dusty roads. Another day beneath the endless Egyptian sky. There was something quietly beautiful in that certainty. As the light mellowed, birds gradually returned to the reeds beside the Nile. Their calls floated gently across the calm water. Fishermen prepared their boats for another evening upon the river. Smoke began rising once again from village ovens. The smell of fresh bread slowly drifted through the warm air. Children who had spent the afternoon helping their families now found a few precious moments to run through narrow lanes, their laughter soft and light before fading once more into the peaceful rhythm of the village. The day was gently turning toward evening, when the heat would loosen its grip, the sky would soften into quiet shades of gold, and tired workers would begin the slow walk home beneath the calm and timeless presence of the Nile. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening. It happened so gently that few people noticed the exact moment when the fierce brightness of the sun began to soften. The hard white light faded into warmer shades of gold, spreading quietly across the Nile Valley. Long shadows stretched over dusty roads, across fields of grain, and along the walls of mud-brick homes that had stood beneath the same sky for many years. The day's greatest heat slowly released its hold. A small breeze wandered through the village. It carried the scent of river water, warm earth, baked bread, and smoke rising from cooking fires that were beginning to glow once again. For the workers, this was one of the most welcome moments of the day. Their shoulders still ached from hours of lifting. Their hands remained rough with dust and stone. Sweat had dried into thin white lines across sun-darkened skin. But now, with evening arriving little by little, every step home felt slightly easier. The young builder who had spent the day shaping limestone carefully placed his tools into a woven basket. Before leaving, he ran his fingers across the smooth face of the stone he had finished. The surface felt cool beneath the growing shade. Tomorrow he would continue. The day after that as well. There was always another stone waiting. Always another wall to raise. The great buildings of Egypt did not appear all at once. They grew almost quietly, one ordinary day after another, carried upward by thousands of patient hands. Nearby, another group of laborers rolled thick ropes into neat circles. Wooden sledges were pulled beneath simple shelters where they would rest until sunrise. Bronze chisels were collected carefully. Every tool mattered. Replacing one was difficult. Repairing one required both skill and precious metal. Nothing useful was left scattered across the ground. Everything had its place. As the final tasks ended, conversation slowly returned. The men spoke more freely now. One wondered whether tomorrow might bring cooler weather. Another spoke about his youngest daughter learning to grind grain by herself. Someone quietly mentioned that the village healer had helped an elderly neighbor who had been suffering from sore joints. These were ordinary conversations. No one spoke of greatness. No one imagined that distant generations would remember the civilization. Their thoughts remained close to home. To family. To food. To tomorrow's work. The road leading back toward the village slowly filled with returning workers. Some walked alone. Others traveled beside friends they had known since childhood. Dust rose beneath countless sandals before settling gently behind them. The pace was slow. There was no reason to hurry now. The day's labor had already been given. Along the roadside, children waited eagerly for fathers, older brothers, uncles, and neighbors to return. One little girl spotted her father long before he saw her. She ran toward him with small, quick steps. Without saying much, he smiled and lifted her into his arms despite his tired muscles. She laughed softly as stone dust brushed lightly onto her linen clothing. Neither seemed to mind. The warmth of home had already begun long before they reached the house. Elsewhere, women were finishing preparations for the evening meal. Clay ovens radiated gentle warmth. Fresh bread cooled upon woven mats. Simple stews simmered inside pottery vessels over glowing coals. The smell of onions, lentils, herbs, and warm grain drifted through narrow streets. The fragrance blended naturally with smoke from small cooking fires. Every home carried its own familiar scent. Inside one courtyard, an elderly woman slowly stirred a pot while watching the changing sky. She had watched thousands of evenings arrive in much the same way. She remembered seasons of plentiful harvests. years when the floods had come just as expected. She also remembered difficult years when families had quietly shared what little they had. Life beside the Nile always demanded patience. The river offered many blessings. But it also required respect. No one believed they controlled it. Instead, they learned to live beside its steady rhythm. As darkness remained some time away, many villagers visited the river before supper. The banks felt cooler now. Children splashed carefully near the edge while older brothers watched them closely. Women filled fresh water jars for the following morning. Their reflections shimmered softly across the calm surface before fading beneath gentle ripples. Several fishermen prepared for another quiet journey. Fishing during the evening often brought different rewards than fishing beneath the bright morning sun. They untied simple ropes securing their boats. The wood creaked softly as each vessel drifted away from shore. Long poles pushed gently against the riverbed. Soon the boats moved almost silently into wider water. The river itself seemed calmer now. The strong sunlight no longer flashed sharply across its surface. Instead, soft golden colors stretched from one bank to the other. A flock of white birds crossed overhead. Their wings caught the last bright light before disappearing toward distant marshes. The fishermen watched without speaking. There was no need to interrupt such peaceful moments. Farther upstream, farmers finished their final inspections of the irrigation channels. They checked that the water continued flowing where it was needed. A broken bank discovered now would save many hours tomorrow. Careful attention at day's end often meant easier work at sunrise. One farmer paused for a moment beside the field. He looked across rows of growing grain gently moving beneath the evening breeze. The plants made a soft whispering sound, almost like quiet voices speaking together. He breathed deeply. The smell of damp earth rose around him. Although his body felt tired, there was satisfaction in seeing healthy crops. The work remained difficult, but the field answered honest labor with life. Slowly he turned toward home. The first stars had not yet appeared, but the sky had already begun changing. Orange became soft amber. Amber slowly blended into pale violet. The desert beyond the fertile valley seemed almost peaceful beneath the fading light. Its endless sand remained still. Only the breeze traced invisible paths across distant dunes. Within the village, lamps began to appear one by one. Small clay bowls filled with oil produced quiet flames that flickered gently inside homes. The light was soft, never harsh. It reached only a short distance before shadows quietly gathered once again. Families slowly assembled for the evening meal. People sat upon woven mats laid across cool floors. Children settled beside parents. Grandparents joined nearby. The food remained simple. Fresh bread broken by hand. Warm lentils. Onions. Beans. Perhaps a little fish grilled over hot coals. Dates provided a touch of sweetness. Water filled clay cups. Sometimes beer brewed from grain accompanied the meal for adults. Nothing was extravagant. Yet after a long day beneath the Egyptian sun, even the simplest supper brought deep comfort. Conversation remained gentle. Children described small adventures from the day. A boy proudly explained that he had carried his first full water jar without spilling it. His older sister smiled quietly. She remembered when that task had once seemed difficult for her as well. An elderly grandfather listened more than he spoke. Occasionally he added a memory from many years before. Not a story of kings. Not a tale of war. Simply a recollection of an especially high flood, or the season when date palms had produced unusually sweet fruit. These ordinary memories became part of family history. They traveled from one generation to the next without ever being written. Outside, darkness slowly settled across the Nile Valley. The day's heat finally slipped away. The breeze grew cooler. Palm leaves rustled softly above sleeping birds. Somewhere beyond the village, frogs began calling from the marshes. Their voices blended with insects hidden among the reeds. The sounds rose gently into the peaceful night. Back inside the homes, the oil lamps burned steadily. Some women repaired torn clothing while there was still enough light to see the fine stitches. A young mother quietly rocked her baby, humming a melody that had likely been sung by mothers long before her own grandmother was born. The tune needed no words. Its gentle rhythm was enough. Nearby, a father carefully repaired the leather straps of his sandals. Tomorrow they would carry him once again across dusty roads. Simple tasks completed before sleep often made the next morning easier. No one rushed. There was still time before rest. Children gradually became quieter. One by one they leaned against their parents, their heavy eyelids slowly closing after a day filled with running, helping, learning, and watching the world around them. Outside, the Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness. It had flowed before these families were born. It would continue long after they were gone. Yet tonight, it carried only quiet reflections of newly appearing stars, while another ordinary day in ancient Egypt gently faded into the calm embrace of night. The evening settled more deeply over the village, and the last traces of daylight slowly disappeared behind the western horizon. The bright colors of sunset faded into gentle shades of blue and gray, until the sky became a wide blanket filled with quiet stars. The desert changed with the coming of night. The fierce heat that had pressed upon the land throughout the day slowly drifted away. The sand released its warmth little by little, and a cool breeze wandered across the open ground before reaching the fertile banks of the Nile. For many families, this was the most peaceful part of the day. The work was finished. The fields had been tended. The ovens had cooled. The fishing nets had been mended. The animals had been fed. For a little while, there was nothing more to ask of tired hands. Inside the mud-brick homes, the soft glow of oil lamps painted gentle circles of light across the walls. The light danced quietly whenever the evening breeze slipped through an open doorway. The rooms themselves were simple. Their walls had been shaped from mud gathered beside the river, mixed with straw, pressed into wooden molds, and dried beneath many days of sunshine. Some houses were only a few small rooms. Others held several generations beneath the same roof. Yet almost every home shared the same feeling of careful usefulness. Nothing existed without purpose. Clay jars stood neatly against the walls. Woven baskets held grain for the coming days. Simple wooden stools rested beside sleeping mats rolled carefully together. Bundles of linen waited to be spread before bedtime. There was little decoration. Beauty came from order. From cleanliness. From knowing exactly where each object belonged. A mother slowly folded a piece of linen she had washed earlier that afternoon. The fabric still carried the clean smell of river water and sunshine. Beside her, her youngest son struggled to keep his eyes open. He listened quietly while his grandmother spoke in a calm, gentle voice. She did not tell stories of famous rulers. Instead, she remembered ordinary seasons. She spoke about a flood that had covered the fields when she was a young girl. She remembered helping her own mother grind grain before sunrise. She described evenings when the river had been so still that the stars seemed to rest upon its surface. The little boy listened carefully. His imagination quietly painted every scene. To him, these memories felt as wonderful as any legend. Outside, The narrow lanes between houses had grown nearly silent. Only a few neighbors remained awake. Two men sat upon low stools beside a doorway, speaking softly while repairing a broken basket. Their fingers moved almost without thought. The work was slow. There was no need to finish quickly. The basket would be ready when it was ready. A woman carrying a clay water jar passed them with a warm smile. They returned the greeting with gentle nods. The village knew itself well. Faces were familiar. Voices were recognized long before anyone came into view. There was comfort in such familiarity. No one hurried through the quiet streets. Even the village dogs stretched lazily beneath the cooling night air. Far beyond the houses, the Nile continued its endless journey. Moonlight shimmered across its gentle current. The surface looked almost like polished stone, broken only by slow ripples where fish rose briefly before disappearing once again beneath the water. A lone fisherman remained upon the river. His small wooden boat drifted almost silently. He had lowered his net hours earlier. Now he waited with calm patience. Fishing required many things. Strong hands. Careful attention. Knowledge of the river. But above all, patience. The river could not be hurried. It offered its gifts in its own time. The fisherman leaned back slightly, listening. The quiet splash of water against the side of the boat. The distant call of a night bird hidden among the reeds. The whisper of wind passing through tall grasses along the shoreline. Each sound belonged naturally to the darkness. None disturbed the peace. He had heard these sounds since childhood. They had become as familiar as his own breathing. Back in the village, another family prepared for sleep. Sleeping arrangements were simple. During the hottest seasons, many people rested upon flat rooftops where the evening breeze could reach them more easily. The roofs, built from wooden beams covered with reeds and packed mud, became peaceful places after sunset. Families spread woven mats across the surface. Linen blankets were folded nearby for the cooler hours before dawn. Children climbed the short stairways with quiet excitement. Sleeping beneath the open sky never seemed ordinary to them. The stars always offered something new to notice. One little girl pointed upward. She asked her father why some stars appeared brighter than others. He smiled gently. He did not claim to know every answer. Instead, he simply looked upward beside her. Together they watched the quiet sky. Sometimes sharing wonder required no explanation at all. Nearby, an elderly couple settled upon their own sleeping mats. They moved more slowly now than they had in younger years. Their knees reminded them of countless days spent working in fields, carrying baskets, lifting stones, and walking dusty roads. Yet there was peace in ending another ordinary day together. The husband looked across the rooftops. Soft lamplight glowed from a few nearby homes. Most had already become dark. The village was falling asleep one household at a time. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. Somewhere, a baby cried briefly before being comforted. A donkey shifted quietly inside a small enclosure. Palm leaves rustled overhead. Then silence returned. Not an empty silence. A living silence. One filled with breathing. With resting. With countless lives recovering their strength for another sunrise. In another part of the village, a young scribe remained awake a little longer. A small oil lamp rested beside his writing palette. Its flame flickered softly as he reviewed the day's records. He checked numbers carefully. Grain received. Grain distributed. Workers counted. Tools repaired. Nothing seemed extraordinary. Yet every line described the quiet work that allowed the village to continue. When he finished, he gently rolled the papyrus and tied it with a thin cord. Tomorrow another record would begin. And another after that. His work, like the work of the farmers and builders, never truly ended. It simply continued with the steady rhythm of life itself. Far beyond the village, jackals wandered across the cool desert beneath the moon. Their distant calls drifted faintly across the open land. The sound reached the village only as a quiet reminder that beyond the fertile valley stretched another world of endless sand and stone. Most people hardly noticed. They had heard those calls all their lives. The desert remained a neighbor, quiet and ancient. The Nile remained their faithful companion. Between the two, generation after generation built homes, raised families, planted crops, baked bread, shaped pottery, carved stone, and lived lives that history would rarely record. Yet these ordinary lives quietly supported everything that would one day make ancient Egypt famous. Every loaf of bread began in a farmer's field. Every temple stone passed through the hands of laborers. Every written record depended upon a patient scribe. Every child learned from parents whose own knowledge had been passed down through countless quiet evenings just like this one. Above them all, the stars turned slowly across the Egyptian sky. The moon climbed a little higher. The night breeze became cooler still. One by one, the final lamps were gently extinguished. Darkness settled softly over the rooftops. Families slept beneath linen coverings, their breathing slow and peaceful. The village rested. Not because its work was complete forever. Only because morning would arrive soon enough, carrying another calm sunrise over the Nile, another scent of fresh bread, another walk along dusty roads, and another ordinary day that would quietly help build one of history's greatest civilizations. The night deepened even further, as if the world itself had settled into a slower breath. Across the Nile Valley, everything remained still. The rooftops where families had gathered earlier were now quiet and dark. Only the faint outline of sleeping shapes could be seen beneath thin linen coverings. The warmth of the day had completely left the earth, and in its place came a gentle coolness that moved softly through narrow streets and between mud-brick walls. Even the river seemed to rest. The Nile did not stop flowing, yet in the darkness it appeared calmer, almost like it was moving through sleep rather than time. Moonlight stretched across its surface in long silver paths that shifted slowly whenever a breeze passed over the water. Reeds along the banks leaned slightly inward, as if listening to the night. In the distance, a few lanterns still glowed faintly inside small riverside shelters where night workers remained awake. Some guarded boats tied to wooden posts. Others watched over stored grain waiting to be moved at dawn. Their presence was quiet, patient, and unchanging. No one spoke more than necessary. Words felt too large for such a soft hour. Far inland, the village had almost fully surrendered to sleep. The sounds of the day had faded one by one. The grinding of grain was gone. The hammering from workshops had stopped. The calls of merchants and children had dissolved into memory. Only the smallest sounds remained. A door shifting slightly in its frame. A piece of rope brushing against a wooden beam. The distant movement of animals settling into rest. Inside one home, a young boy shifted in his sleep on a woven mat. His breathing was slow and even. One arm rested beneath his head, while the other lay loosely across his chest. Beside him, his mother remained awake for a little longer. She sat quietly in the dim light of a nearly finished oil lamp. Her hands rested in her lap. She was not working now. Not thinking about grain or water or the tasks of tomorrow. She simply listened to the silence of her home. There was a comfort in this silence. A sense that everything had found its place for the night. Her gaze moved slowly across the small room. A clay jar in the corner. A bundle of linen folded neatly beside the wall. A wooden stool turned slightly toward the sleeping area. Each object belonged exactly where it was. Nothing felt uncertain. Nothing felt unfinished. Outside, a soft wind passed through the village. It carried the scent of the river again, mixed with the dry warmth of earth that still lingered beneath the surface of the ground. The wind moved gently across rooftops, slipping between small openings in walls, and then disappearing toward the fields beyond. There, the crops stood quietly in rows. Young stalks of grain bent slightly under the night air, as if bowing to the darkness. No one watched them now. But they were not forgotten. Even in sleep, farmers trusted the land to continue its quiet work. Growth did not stop simply because people rested. Time continued its slow shaping of everything. On the edge of the village, an old fisherman sat alone beside his small boat. He had returned from the river earlier but had not yet gone inside his home. He liked this part of the night. The moment when the water and sky became nearly one color. The moment when even thought seemed to slow down. He looked out toward the river, where the faint reflection of stars drifted across the surface. He had spent most of his life near this water. He had seen it rise and fall. He had watched it bring fish, then take them away again. He had learned when to cast nets and when to simply wait. Now, in his older years, he understood something simple. The river did not belong to anyone. It simply continued. And life beside it meant learning how to move with it, not against it. He exhaled slowly. Then finally stood and walked toward his home. Inside the village, the last few oil lamps were being extinguished. A thin thread of smoke rose from each wick before disappearing into the cool air. With each fading flame, another corner of the village slipped deeper into darkness. Soon there was no light left at all. Only the moon. Only the stars. Only the quiet shape of sleeping rooftops. Even the jackals in the far desert had grown silent for a while. The night felt complete, as if the world had reached a natural pause. Above everything, the sky stretched endlessly. It held no hurry. No direction. Just a vast stillness filled with distant light. Time passed without being noticed. Minutes became hours. Hours dissolved into the deep softness of night. And within that silence, life continued to rest. Bodies healed without effort. Breathing remained steady. Dreams moved quietly behind closed eyes. The entire village, with all its workers, farmers, scribes, builders, and families, existed now in a shared stillness that required nothing from them. Only rest. Only pause. Only the gentle waiting for morning. And somewhere beyond the edge of the desert horizon, the first faint suggestion of change began to form. Not light yet. Not dawn. Only the earliest sense that night, like everything else, would slowly give way when its time arrived. But for now, ancient Egypt slept. Softly. Deeply. And without end in its quiet rhythm of ordinary lives. Long before the first light touched the eastern edge of the sky, the Nile Valley remained wrapped in darkness. The stars still shone clearly above the quiet river. The moon had drifted lower during the night, leaving much of the valley beneath a blanket of soft shadows. The air felt cooler than it had only a few hours before. It carried the fresh scent of damp earth, reeds, and water that had rested peacefully beneath the night sky. This was the quietest hour of all. Even the insects seemed to sing more softly. The village appeared almost forgotten, as though every house had become part of the earth itself. Mud brick walls blended into the darkness. Flat rooftops lay still beneath sleeping families. Clay jars stood silently beside doorways, waiting for another day's use. Nothing hurried toward morning. Time itself seemed content to move one slow breath at a time. A gentle breeze crossed the river. It slipped through tall reeds before wandering between the narrow lanes of the village. The breeze carried tiny grains of cool sand that settled almost unnoticed upon stone thresholds and woven mats left outside overnight. Inside one home, an elderly woman stirred before anyone else. She did not wake suddenly. Her eyes opened gradually. For a few moments she remained still, listening. She could hear the quiet breathing of her family around her. A grandchild sleeping peacefully nearby. Her daughter resting after another long day of work. The familiar creak of the roof beams above. She smiled softly. Every sound belonged exactly where it should. She rose carefully so as not to disturb the others. Her bare feet touched the cool earthen floor. The sensation reminded her that the hottest hours of the coming day were still far away. She stepped outside. The sky above was filled with countless stars. Many mornings had begun like this. Thousands, perhaps. She had stopped counting long ago. Instead, she simply appreciated the peaceful silence before work returned. Across the village, another figure appeared in the darkness. A baker had awakened early. Bread required patience. The grain had already been ground. The flour waited inside covered bowls. Now water was added carefully. Hands folded the mixture again and again. The dough slowly came together beneath practiced fingers. There was no wasted movement. Every motion had been repeated so many times that it no longer required thought. His hands remembered everything. Nearby, a small fire was gently encouraged back to life. A few glowing embers still remained beneath yesterday's ashes. Dry reeds and small pieces of wood were placed carefully above them. Soon a tiny orange flame appeared. It flickered quietly before growing stronger. Its warmth spread slowly through the small baking room. The smell of smoke rose gently into the cool morning air. One by one, other homes began showing similar signs of life. A door opened softly. Someone swept a courtyard with a bundle of palm fibers. Another person drew fresh water from a storage jar. No loud voices broke the stillness. People respected these peaceful moments before sunrise. They moved almost instinctively with gentle hands and quiet footsteps. Beyond the village, the river continued its endless journey. The water reflected the fading stars like polished black glass. A fisherman arrived at the bank carrying rolled nets across one shoulder. He paused before stepping into his boat. For a moment he simply looked across the water. The silence felt complete. He could hear only the smallest ripples touching the shore. Some mornings he enjoyed this moment more than the fishing itself. The river asked nothing of him except patience. He untied the rope securing the boat. The knot came free easily. With one careful push, the boat drifted away from the muddy bank. The pole touched the riverbed. Slowly the boat glided into deeper water. Each movement was smooth and familiar. The fisherman knew exactly how much pressure to use. Too much would disturb the quiet water. Too little would leave the boat standing still. Soon he disappeared into the gentle darkness. Farther inland, farmers also began preparing for another day. A father quietly shook his eldest son awake. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes. He was still growing accustomed to rising before dawn. His father smiled kindly. There had been a time when he too found early mornings difficult. Now they felt as natural as breathing. Together they stepped outside. The cool air refreshed tired faces. Above them the eastern horizon showed only the faintest hint of gray. The father pointed toward the fields. No words were necessary. The work waiting there had remained unchanged through many generations. The two walked side by side along the familiar path. Their sandals pressed gently into the dust. Small stones shifted beneath each careful step. The fields greeted them with quiet stillness. Young grain stood covered in tiny drops of moisture gathered during the cool night. The plants seemed almost silver beneath the fading moonlight. The father bent down. He touched the soil lightly. Still damp. Still healthy. Still ready for another day beneath the Egyptian sun. Nearby, a pair of oxen waited patiently inside a simple enclosure. They recognized the sound of approaching footsteps. One lifted its head slowly. The animals had their own rhythm. Their own quiet understanding of the seasons. Year after year they helped pull wooden plows through rich black earth left behind by the Nile's generous floods. The father gently stroked one animal's neck before fastening the harness. There was no force in his movements. Only familiarity built over many seasons. The young boy watched carefully. Every morning became another lesson. Not spoken. Demonstrated. Little by little he learned where to place each strap. How tightly it should rest. How calmly the animals responded when treated with patience. Knowledge passed quietly through simple routines. It did not need long speeches. The sky slowly brightened. The stars nearest the horizon disappeared first. Others remained overhead a little longer before quietly fading as well. Birds hidden among the reeds began calling one after another. At first only a single voice echoed across the water. Soon another answered. Then another. Before long the entire riverbank seemed alive with soft morning songs. The breeze carried those sounds toward the village. Families heard them while preparing breakfast. Children stirred beneath linen blankets. Dogs stretched lazily near doorways. Goats began moving about their small enclosures. Life awakened not all at once, but gently, as though the entire valley shared one slow heartbeat. Inside the baker's home, the first flat loaves entered the warm clay oven. The smell spread almost immediately. Fresh bread. Warm grain. A faint hint of smoke. The fragrance drifted through nearby streets before floating toward the fields. Many people smiled almost without noticing. It was the smell of another ordinary morning. A smell that had greeted countless generations before them. A smell that quietly promised enough strength to meet another day of work. As the eastern sky turned pale gold, the first rays of sunlight reached the highest palm leaves. The tops of the trees glowed softly while the village below remained wrapped in cool shadow. Little by little the light continued downward. Mud brick walls brightened. Clay jars reflected warm colors. The dusty road slowly emerged from darkness. The Nile itself caught the sunlight last. For one brief moment, the calm water became a ribbon of shining gold stretching through the heart of Egypt. The new day had arrived. Not with noise. Not with celebration. Only with quiet certainty. Another sunrise. Another morning beside the river. Another day of ordinary work that, without anyone realizing it, would continue building one of the greatest civilizations the world would ever remember. The first sunlight spread slowly across the valley, touching one corner of the village after another. What had been quiet shapes in the darkness slowly became homes once more. Mud brick walls warmed beneath the gentle rays, and the flat rooftops where families had slept began to fill with quiet movement. People rose without haste. There was no bell to announce the beginning of the day. No loud voice called everyone to work. The rhythm had long since become part of their lives. They woke because the morning had arrived. Because the bread needed baking. Because the fields waited. because the river continued flowing, just as it always had. On one rooftop, a father carefully rolled the family's woven sleeping mats. He shook away a thin layer of dust that had settled during the night and tied each mat with a strip of linen. His movements were slow and practiced. Beside him, his youngest daughter folded the family's light blankets with great concentration. She wanted to help. The blanket was almost as large as she was, and each fold came out slightly uneven. Her father noticed but said nothing. Instead, he smiled gently and folded his own blanket beside hers. The little girl watched carefully. Without realizing it, she copied his next movement. Then another. Little lessons like these happened every morning. No one called them lessons. They were simply part of living together. Nearby, an elderly woman poured fresh water from a large storage jar into smaller clay vessels that would be carried throughout the day. She paused for a moment, holding one cup between her hands. The water felt wonderfully cool. She drank slowly. Each sip reminded her how precious the river truly was. Without it, there would be no fields, no gardens, no bread, no village. The Nile gave life quietly, asking only that people understand its seasons. Outside the homes, narrow streets slowly filled once again. Children swept doorways with bundles of reeds. Dust rose in soft clouds before settling back onto the ground. Women carried empty baskets toward nearby ovens. Men adjusted leather sandal straps before beginning the walk toward fields and workshops. The village awakened not through sudden movement but through countless small tasks unfolding together. A pair of goats wandered between houses, stopping now and then to nibble at bits of dry vegetation growing beside the walls. A sleepy dog stretched slowly before finding a patch of early sunlight. Several chickens scratched quietly in the dust, searching patiently for seeds and insects hidden beneath the surface. Even the animals followed familiar routines. Nothing seemed uncertain. The village knew exactly how another day should begin. Near the edge of the settlement, smoke curled upward from the communal bakery. The baker had already removed the first loaves from the clay oven. They rested upon woven trays, their crusts lightly browned, filling the cool morning air with a rich, comforting aroma. People arrived carrying their own prepared dough. Some waited quietly. Others exchanged gentle greetings while standing in line. One woman asked after an elderly neighbor who had been feeling tired the previous week. Another spoke softly about the coming harvest. Their voices remained calm. Morning conversations rarely rushed. There would be many hours ahead for work. No one wished to spend the precious coolness of dawn in unnecessary haste. As fresh loaves were placed into waiting baskets, the warmth spread through the woven reeds. Children walking beside their mothers smiled as the smell drifted upward. Sometimes they were given a small piece of warm bread before reaching home. It was simple, plain, still steaming from the oven. To them, it was enough to make the morning feel especially kind. Farther along the road, a potter opened the wooden shutters of his workshop. The room inside still held the coolness of night. Rows of finished jars stood waiting along the walls. Some were tall enough to store grain for many months. Others were small enough to fit comfortably inside two hands. Each vessel had dried slowly beneath careful attention. The potter ran his fingers lightly across one smooth surface. There were no cracks. No weak places. The clay had cured well. He nodded quietly to himself. Soon another day's work would begin. Fresh clay rested beneath damp cloths, ready to be shaped. His will stood where he had left it the evening before. Nothing had changed. There was comfort in that. Across the village, a young apprentice hurried toward the stone workshop. He was still learning. Each morning he arrived a little earlier than necessary. Not because anyone demanded it, but because he enjoyed watching the master craftsmen prepare their tools. The older mason greeted him with a warm nod. Without speaking, he handed the young man a bundle of bronze chisels. Together they sat beneath the shade of a simple shelter. One by one they inspected each tool. Edges worn dull by yesterday's work were sharpened carefully against smooth stones. The apprentice watched tiny sparks appear where bronze met stone. The master paused occasionally, allowing the younger man to repeat the movement. The first attempts were uneven. Some strokes were too firm, others too gentle. The older craftsman simply adjusted the apprentice's hands. No criticism. Only quiet guidance. Skills grew slowly. Like young trees beside the river. Patiently. Season after season. By now, sunlight had spread fully across the village. The coolness of dawn lingered only in shaded corners. Farmers had already reached their fields. Some guided wooden plows behind patient oxen. Others carried woven baskets filled with seed. The rich black soil left by the Nile's flood crumbled softly beneath their feet. It felt different from the dry desert beyond the valley. Dark. Moist. Full of promise. One farmer knelt beside a small irrigation channel. During the night, a little mud had slipped into the waterway. With his hands he carefully cleared the blockage. Water immediately began flowing once again. It moved quietly between the rows of crops, soaking the thirsty earth. He watched for several moments. Satisfied, he stood and continued down the field. Nearby, his wife gathered herbs growing along the edge of a small garden. Mint. Coriander. Leeks. Simple plants that added welcome flavor to everyday meals. She carried them carefully in a woven basket resting against her hip. The morning breeze carried their fresh scent across the field. It mixed gently with damp soil and warm sunshine. Beyond the cultivated land, fishermen returned from the earliest hours upon the river. Their boats glided slowly toward shore. Some had caught enough fish to fill heavy baskets. Others carried only a modest catch. No one complained. The river had offered what it wished. Tomorrow might be different. That thought never troubled them. Life beside the Nile had taught patience more thoroughly than any teacher ever could. As they stepped onto the muddy bank, neighbors greeted them with quiet smiles. Fish would soon be cleaned, salted, cooked, or traded. Nothing would be wasted. Even the smallest catch had value. Nearby, children waited eagerly to help carry baskets back toward the village. Though the loads were light, they accepted the task proudly. Every responsibility, however small, made them feel a little older. A little more useful. The fishermen thanked them with gentle smiles. By mid-morning, the village had fully settled into its familiar rhythm. The sound of grinding grain returned. The tapping of stonemasons echoed softly through the warm air. Potters shaped clay. Weavers passed thread through linen. Scribes unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus beneath shaded courtyards. Donkeys carried supplies along dusty roads. The smell of baking bread slowly gave way to the scent of sun-warmed earth. The Nile shimmered beneath the climbing sun, flowing quietly past fields, homes, workshops, and temples still rising stone by stone. Everywhere, ordinary people continued their ordinary work. No one imagined that thousands of years later, their quiet routines would still matter. Yet it was these mornings, these careful hands, these shared meals, these long walks beneath the Egyptian sun, and these countless acts of patient labor that became the unseen foundation beneath one of history's most enduring civilizations. And so, as the morning matured toward another warm afternoon, the village continued its steady heartbeat, one peaceful task following another, beneath the endless blue sky of ancient Egypt. The sun climbed a little higher with each passing hour. Its light settled gently over the Nile Valley, turning the damp fields into wide patches of shining green. The cool air of early morning slowly slipped away, replaced by a growing warmth that everyone expected and accepted. No one hurried because of the heat. They simply adjusted their pace. The farmers in the fields lowered their heads beneath simple linen cloths wrapped loosely around their hair. The cloth offered only a little shade, but after many seasons they knew even a little shade could make a long day feel easier. The rich soil beneath their feet still held moisture from the river. Each step left a clear footprint that slowly softened as water moved quietly through the irrigation channels. One elderly farmer paused beside a young sycamore fig tree. Its branches were still small compared with the older trees near the village, but its leaves cast a patch of cool shadow across the ground. He rested there for only a few moments. Not because he wished to stop working. Only because his body had learned that steady work lasted longer than hurried work. He removed his clay water jar from a woven sling and drank slowly. The water was no longer cool. The morning sun had already warmed it. Even so, it refreshed him. He wiped a few drops from his beard and smiled quietly before returning to the field. Nearby, his grandson followed carefully behind. The boy carried a small basket of seeds. He watched every movement the old man made. How deep each handful should be placed. How far apart the rows should remain. When to walk. When to pause. The lessons came without long explanations. The earth itself became the teacher. If the rows were uneven, the plants would show it. If the water flowed poorly, the leaves would reveal the mistake. Nature spoke softly. Those who lived beside the Nile learned to listen. Farther along the riverbank, women gathered bundles of fresh papyrus. The tall green stalks swayed gently as they were cut with bronze knives. Some would become rope. Others would be woven into mats or baskets. The finest stalks might one day become smooth sheets for writing. The work required patience. Each stalk had to be chosen carefully. Too young, and the fibers were weak. Too old, and they became coarse. The women sorted them into neat bundles tied with strips of flax. Their hands moved confidently. Years of practice had taught them exactly what to look for. As they worked, they spoke quietly together. One remembered her son's first day helping at the potter's workshop. Another wondered whether her sister's family might visit after the harvest. Their voices rose and fell gently, blending with the sound of reeds brushing together in the breeze. Occasionally they laughed. Not loudly. Only enough to brighten the morning. The laughter drifted away across the water before disappearing into the wide open sky. Across the village, the potter's wheel turned steadily. Its slow spinning created a quiet rhythm inside the shaded workshop. The potter dipped his hands into a bowl of water before touching the clay. Immediately the rough mound began to change. His thumbs pressed gently into the center. His fingers guided the soft earth upward. Little by little, the shape emerged. First a simple cylinder. Then gently widening sides. Finally, the graceful curve of a storage jar. The apprentice sitting nearby watched every movement. He had tried many times. Sometimes the walls became too thin. Sometimes they leaned to one side. Occasionally the entire vessel collapsed back into a shapeless mound. The master never grew impatient. He simply gathered the clay together once more. Again, he would say softly. The apprentice smiled. He knew every mistake brought him one step closer to learning. Outside the workshop, a pair of donkeys stood quietly beneath a palm tree. Their baskets were filled with finished pottery waiting to be delivered. The animals flicked their tails lazily as flies buzzed around them. They had carried heavy loads along these roads for many years. The paths between villages were familiar beneath their steady hooves. When the merchant finally emerged from the workshop, he gently checked each rope before fastening the baskets securely. A cracked pot could mean many days of wasted effort. Everything was tied with care. The merchant patted one donkey's neck before beginning the slow journey north. Dust rose softly behind them. Not far away, a carpenter sat cross-legged outside his small workshop. The scent of freshly cut acacia wood filled the air around him. Thin curls of wood gathered beside his feet as he shaped a smooth board with a bronze blade. He paused often to examine the grain. Wood carried its own quiet character. Some pieces bent easily. Others resisted. The carpenter learned to work with the wood rather than against it. Beside him rested several finished stools. Simple. Strong. Balanced carefully upon four sturdy legs. Nearby, a child ran curious fingers across one smooth surface. The carpenter smiled warmly. "Feel how smooth it has become," he said. The child nodded with wide eyes. He could hardly imagine the rough piece of timber becoming something so useful. The carpenter handed him a small piece of sanded wood. The child rubbed it between his hands again and again, enjoying its gentle texture. Sometimes learning began simply by touching. Near the center of the village, the scribe sat beneath a shaded awning where the sunlight could not reach his delicate papyrus sheets. His reed pen moved steadily. The black ink flowed across the pale surface with graceful precision. He recorded grain deliveries arriving from nearby farms. He counted baskets of onions. He noted jars of oil. Every mark upon the page represented hours of someone else's labor. A basket did not simply appear. Someone had woven it. Someone had filled it. Someone had carried it across dusty roads. The scribe understood this well. Although his own work was quiet, it connected him to every corner of the village. Occasionally someone approached with a question. A merchant wished to confirm a shipment. A foreman reported the number of workers present that morning. The scribe listened patiently before making another careful entry. His handwriting remained neat despite the growing heat. Accuracy mattered. Future decisions depended upon these simple records. Above him, a swallow darted through the open courtyard. It circled once before disappearing into the bright sky. The scribe looked up briefly. Then, with a small smile, he returned to his writing. Beyond the homes, near the edge of the construction grounds, groups of builders prepared another massive limestone block. Thick ropes were checked once more. Wooden rollers were positioned beneath the heavy stone. Foremen walked slowly among the workers, speaking calmly. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the rhythm. At a quiet signal, dozens of hands gripped the ropes. Feet pressed firmly into the earth. Shoulders leaned forward. The first pull came together. The stone did not move. No one seemed surprised. They adjusted their footing. The ropes tightened again. This time the great block shifted ever so slightly. Only a finger's width. But it had moved. A few more steady pulls followed. The limestone slid slowly across the prepared path. Wood creaked. Ropes stretched. Sand whispered beneath the weight. The progress seemed almost invisible. Yet by the end of the day, the stone would rest several body lengths farther than it had that morning. That was enough. Great works were built through countless small successes like this. No single day completed them. Each sunrise added only a little. Each sunset left something unfinished. Yet season after season, those little efforts quietly became walls, courtyards, columns, and temples that would stand beneath the Egyptian sky for generations. The workers never rushed to imagine the finished structure. Their attention remained upon the next careful step, the next steady pull, the next breath shared together beneath the warm desert sun. And all across the valley, from the quiet fields to the shaded workshops, from the calm riverbanks to the dusty roads winding between villages, ordinary life continued with the same peaceful rhythm that had carried ancient Egypt forward for countless years, one gentle day at a time. The steady work continued as the morning slowly drifted toward midday. The sun climbed higher until its light rested directly above the valley. Shadows that had stretched long across the fields at dawn now gathered close beneath trees, walls, and the feet of the workers themselves. The sky had become a clear, endless blue, without a single cloud to soften its brightness. Even so, life did not stop. It simply slowed. The builders eased their pace, knowing that strength was best saved for the many hours still ahead. The foreman understood this as well. A tired worker who rested for a few moments could often accomplish more than one who pushed too hard beneath the growing heat. Near the construction grounds, a water carrier made his familiar rounds. Across his shoulders rested a smooth wooden yoke. From each end hung a large clay jar that swayed gently with every careful step. The jars were heavy, yet he carried them with remarkable balance. He had learned exactly how to walk. Too quickly, and the water would spill. Too slowly, and many thirsty workers would be left waiting. His path through the worksite had become almost as familiar as the paths leading through his own village. The builders welcomed him with grateful smiles. One by one they cupped their hands while he poured fresh water into them. Some drank quietly. Others rinsed the dust from their faces before returning to work. No one lingered longer than necessary. Everyone knew the water carrier still had many people to visit before the day was done. His work was no less important than theirs. Without fresh water, the great stones would remain where they rested. Farther away, beneath the shade of a woven reed shelter, several women prepared the midday meal for family members working nearby. Flat loaves of bread were arranged carefully inside woven baskets lined with clean linen. Small clay bowls held onions, beans, cucumbers, and herbs gathered during the cool hours of the morning. Another basket carried dried dates whose sweet taste offered welcome comfort after long hours of labor. Everything was packed with care. The baskets would soon travel to fields, workshops, and riverbanks where hungry hands waited. A young girl helped her mother tie one basket closed. She pulled the flax cord a little too tightly. The bread inside became slightly pressed together. Her mother laughed softly. Not to tease her. Only because she remembered making the same mistake herself many years earlier. Together they loosened the cord and tied it once again. This time it rested gently against the basket. The little girl smiled proudly. Some lessons were learned through watching. Others through trying. Across the village, the scent of warm bread still lingered in the air, though now it mixed with the smell of drying clay, fresh-cut wood, and sun-warmed stone. The sounds of daily work blended into a quiet music. The steady scrape of a broom across a courtyard. The gentle tapping of a bronze chisel. The turning of a potter's wheel. The distant voices of fishermen calling softly across the river. None of these sounds demanded attention. Together they formed the familiar heartbeat of the settlement. Inside the weaving house, The afternoon's first length of linen was nearly complete. The fabric stretched smoothly between wooden beams. Its pale color reflected the sunlight entering through the open doorway. A master weaver examined every thread. She ran her fingertips lightly across the cloth. There were no loose fibers. No uneven places. The linen felt strong. It would serve its owner well for many seasons. Beside her, a younger woman worked more slowly. She counted each crossing thread beneath her breath. One. Then another. Then another. The rhythm calmed her. Each careful movement built upon the one before it. By the time the cloth reached the end of the loom, hundreds upon hundreds of tiny crossings would hold it together. The work reminded her that many small efforts often created something lasting. Outside, children gathered beneath the broad branches of an old sycamore tree where the shade remained cool despite the growing heat. Some had already finished the small chores given to them that morning. Others still carried little baskets or bundles of reeds collected for their families. For a short while they rested together. One boy traced simple shapes in the dust using a small stick. A younger child watched closely before drawing shapes of her own beside his. They erased them with their hands and began again. There was quiet happiness in such simple play. Nearby, an old storyteller sat upon a low stone. His hair had turned white many years before, and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. Children often gathered near him during the warmest part of the day. Not because he told grand tales of mighty rulers. Instead, he spoke about ordinary things. He remembered the first time he guided oxen through a flooded field. He recalled the smell of fresh reeds after the waters had begun to fall. He described mornings when mist covered the Nile so completely that boats seemed to float through clouds. The children listened with quiet attention. These stories belonged to everyday life. Yet they carried the gentle wisdom of many seasons. The old man paused now and then, allowing silence to settle between his words. No one hurried him. The pauses were part of the story. A soft breeze wandered through the leaves above. The branches answered with a gentle rustle. Several children leaned comfortably against the tree trunk, their eyes growing heavy in the warmth. The storyteller smiled. He understood that sometimes the most peaceful stories were those that drifted gently toward sleep. Meanwhile, along the riverbank, a group of women washed linen clothing upon smooth flat stones. They dipped each garment into the cool water before rubbing it carefully with fine sand and ash. The movement was slow and steady. Water splashed quietly around their hands. The clean linen was spread across reeds and low bushes where the bright sunlight would dry it before evening. As they worked, they watched boats passing quietly along the river. Some carried baskets of grain. Others transported limestone blocks from distant quarries. A few held nothing more than fishermen returning with modest catches. Each boat moved at its own gentle pace. The river accepted them all without hurry. A heron stood motionless near the reeds. Its long legs barely disturbed the shallow water. For many minutes it did not move at all. Then, with perfect patience, it lowered its head and caught a small fish before returning once again to complete stillness. One of the women smiled as she watched. "The birds know the river well," she said softly. Another nodded. They never seemed to rush. The conversation ended there. Nothing more needed to be added. Not far away, the fishermen repaired their nets beneath a simple shelter made from bundled reeds. Tiny holes had appeared after many days upon the water. Each one required careful attention. The knots were tied slowly. Firm enough to hold. Gentle enough not to weaken the cord. One fisherman handed a net to his eldest son. "Feel it," he said quietly. The boy ran both hands across the woven fibers. He learned to notice rough places, loose knots, small tears that might grow larger if ignored. These were lessons that could not be written on papyrus. They lived only in hands, eyes, and patient practice. By now, the warmth of midday rested fully across the Nile Valley. The desert beyond shimmered beneath the bright sun, while the fertile land beside the river remained alive with quiet purpose. Everywhere, ordinary people continued the work that had filled their days for generations. Farmers tended the fields. Builders shaped stone. Scribes recorded careful lines upon papyrus. Potters guided clay beneath steady hands. Weavers crossed thread after thread. Fishermen trusted the river. Merchants followed dusty roads. Children learned by watching those who came before them. No trumpet announced these moments. No monument recorded every quiet kindness, every shared meal, every careful lesson between parent and child. Yet these unnoticed hours became the true foundation of ancient Egypt. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they happened again tomorrow, and the day after that, and through countless seasons beside the calm, patient waters of the Nile, where ordinary lives quietly built a civilization that would outlive them all. The warmth of midday settled gently over the valley like a familiar blanket. The bright sun stood high above the Nile, and its light reflected from the quiet water until the river seemed to shine with countless tiny points of gold. Along the banks, the reeds barely moved. Even the breeze appeared to rest for a little while during the hottest part of the day. Across the fields, the pace of work became slower. No one stopped completely. There was still grain to tend, canals to watch, and tools to carry. But every movement became more measured. Every step was taken with care. The farmers understood the rhythm of the land. They had learned long ago that the hottest hours were not meant for rushing. Strength was something to be protected, just as carefully as grain stored inside clay jars. Beneath the shade of a broad sycamore tree, several laborers gathered for a short rest. Their linen clothing was covered with a fine layer of pale dust. Their hands showed small cuts and rough patches earned from many seasons of work. One by one they lowered themselves onto woven mats spread across the cool ground. No one spoke at first. The silence itself felt welcome. Each man removed his water jar and drank slowly. The water had become warm beneath the sun, but it still eased the dryness in their throats. One worker closed his eyes for a few quiet moments. He listened to the sounds around him. Leaves rustling softly overhead. The distant call of a bird near the river. The gentle murmur of water moving through an irrigation channel. Somewhere far away came the faint tapping of stone against stone. Even during rest, the village continued breathing. After a while, one of the older builders reached into a small basket beside him. Inside were several pieces of flat bread wrapped in linen. He broke one loaf into equal portions and quietly handed a piece to each of the others. No one counted. No one measured. The sharing happened naturally. Along with the bread came onions, a handful of olives, and a few dried dates whose sweetness lingered pleasantly after each bite. The meal was simple. Yet after hours beneath the Egyptian sun, it felt more satisfying than any feast. The men ate slowly. They appreciated every mouthful. Nearby, a young apprentice sat with his back against the tree trunk. His shoulders still ached from carrying tools earlier that morning. He watched the older workers carefully. None of them seemed troubled by the weight of the day. They spoke little. They chewed slowly. Now and then one smiled quietly at another. The apprentice began to understand that strength was not only found in muscles. It was also found in patience. in calmness, in accepting that every day asked for steady effort rather than hurried speed. When the meal had ended, crumbs were gathered carefully from the linen cloth. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest piece of bread carried the memory of planted fields, harvested grain, hours of grinding, careful kneading, and patient baking. Farther away, where the fields reached almost to the river's edge, women harvested fresh vegetables from small garden plots. They moved among rows of onions, beans, and herbs with woven baskets hanging comfortably from one arm. The plants had grown well this season. Their leaves remained healthy beneath careful watering. One woman gently brushed soil from a freshly pulled onion before placing it into her basket. Another gathered bunches of fragrant herbs. Their scent filled the warm air with fresh, earthy sweetness. The women spoke quietly as they worked. One mentioned that her youngest son had begun learning to write simple symbols from a village scribe. Another smiled as she remembered teaching her daughter to shape bread for the first time. Their conversations flowed as gently as the nearby water. Sometimes they fell silent altogether. The quiet never felt uncomfortable. The work itself offered enough company. Closer to the river, a fisherman sat repairing a wooden oar that had begun to split near its handle. He examined the grain of the wood with careful attention. Using a small bronze knife, he smoothed the damaged area before wrapping it tightly with thin strips of leather. His hands moved slowly. There was no reason to hurry. A poorly repaired oar might fail in the middle of the river. A careful repair could last for many more seasons. His young daughter sat beside him, watching every movement. She held the leather strips while her father worked. Occasionally she asked a quiet question. He answered with gentle patience. Some skills belong to fishermen. Others belong to farmers or potters. Yet nearly all of them were passed from one generation to the next in moments exactly like these. Not inside grand buildings. Not during formal lessons. Simply while sitting together beneath the warm afternoon sun. Back in the village, the potter carried several newly shaped jars into an open courtyard where they would dry before firing. He arranged them carefully in long, even rows. Each vessel stood slightly apart from the next so the warm air could move freely between them. The clay still held a faint coolness from the water mixed into it earlier that morning. By tomorrow, it would feel completely different. Firm. Dry. Ready for the kill. The potter paused for a moment to admire the quiet order of the rows. There was satisfaction in seeing many hours of work resting peacefully before him. A cat wandered silently through the courtyard. It stepped carefully between the jars without touching a single one. The potter smiled. The cat had explored this workshop for years. It knew every corner almost as well as he did. Near the center of the village, a group of children helped an elderly neighbor carry bundles of dried reeds toward her home. The bundles were not especially heavy, but they were awkward to carry alone. Each child took hold of one end. Together they walked slowly through the narrow lane. The old woman thanked them warmly. She offered each of them a small date from a clay bowl resting near her doorway. The children accepted with quiet smiles. Acts of kindness often passed unnoticed. No one expected praise. Helping one another had become as ordinary as drawing water from the river. The afternoon continued its gentle journey. The bright light slowly softened, though the sun still stood high. A breeze returned at last, carrying with it the cool scent of the Nile. It slipped through palm leaves, crossed dusty roads, and wandered into open workshops where tired workers welcomed its touch. Even the oxen in the fields lifted their heads slightly as the moving air reached them. Beyond the cultivated land, the desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Its rolling sand lay silent beneath the sky. From the edge of the fields, it seemed impossible that life could exist there. Yet here beside the river, everything flourished. Green plants, mud-brick homes, fishing boats, children's laughter, fresh bread, quiet conversations, patient hands shaping clay and stone. The contrast had become so familiar that few people stopped to think about it. The Nile simply gave them the world they knew. As the afternoon slowly leaned toward evening once more, long shadows began to return across the fields. Workers noticed them without speaking. Another day was quietly beginning its slow journey toward rest. Soon the ovens would be warmed again. Families would gather beneath the gentle light of oil lamps. Boats would drift softly across the evening river. The smell of fresh bread would once again fill the village streets. But for now, beneath the warm and peaceful Egyptian sky, ordinary life continued with its calm and steady rhythm, one thoughtful task following another, just as it had for generations along the timeless waters of the Nile. The afternoon light began to soften again, not because the day had changed quickly, but because time itself was moving in its slow, familiar rhythm. Across the Nile Valley, shadows stretched a little longer with each passing moment. The sun was still strong, still bright, yet it no longer felt like it stood directly overhead. There was a quiet suggestion in the air that the day was slowly turning toward evening once more. In the fields, farmers noticed it first. Not with words. Only with feeling. The heat no longer grew stronger. It simply remained steady, as if the land had reached the peak of its warmth and now rested there for a while before letting go. A group of workers paused beside an irrigation channel. One of them leaned down and touched the water with his fingers. It was still cool beneath the surface, sheltered from the sun by the narrow earthen walls. He let the water run through his hand for a few quiet seconds before standing again. No one rushed him. No one needed to. The channel would continue flowing whether they watched it or not. Nearby, a young boy carried a bundle of freshly cut reeds across a narrow footpath. The reeds were long and uneven, their green ends still carrying the smell of the river. He held them tightly against his chest, careful not to let them fall into the dust. His steps were small but steady. Each one left faint prints behind him that the wind would soon soften away. When he reached a shaded corner near his home, he set the bundle down with relief. His mother was already there, preparing the space where the reeds would be woven later into mats and baskets. She looked at him and nodded gently. Not a word was needed. He had done what was asked of him. That was enough. In another part of the village, a group of women gathered around a low grinding stone. The morning grain had already been baked into bread for the day, but new grain was being prepared for tomorrow. One woman poured small handfuls onto the stone while another slowly pushed the heavier upper stone forward and back in a steady motion. The sound was soft but constant. Stone against stone. A quiet rhythm that belonged to the heart of daily life. Dust from the grain rose slightly in the air, catching the sunlight in faint golden particles before settling again. The women spoke in low voices as they worked. Their conversation moved easily between small things. The price of clay jars. The strength of the morning wind. A child's first steps. A neighbor's illness slowly improving. Nothing urgent. Nothing heavy. Just the kind of talk that filled long afternoons and made the work feel less tiring. Farther away, near the edge of the river, a man stood alone watching the water move past him. He was not fishing. Not working. Only watching. The Nile always appeared different at this hour. The bright reflections of midday had softened. The surface now carried a deeper color, a mix of gold and blue that shifted with every small ripple. He remembered how the river had looked when he was a child, and how it had looked when his father had stood in the same place, and how, he imagined, it would look when his own children grew older and stood here in turn. The river did not change its language. Only the people beside it changed with time. A small boat drifted slowly past him. Inside, a fisherman rested with his net folded neatly at his feet. He raised a hand in silent greeting. The man by the riverbank returned the gesture. Neither spoke. There was no need. The river carried all conversation quietly between them. Back in the village, the sound of hammering stone had grown softer. Not because the work had stopped, but because the builders had shifted their attention to lighter tasks. Smoothing edges. Checking alignments. Preparing tools for the next day. The largest blocks of stone stood where they had been placed earlier, their surfaces glowing faintly in the warm afternoon light. They looked still. Patient. As if they too were waiting for something beyond the day. A foreman walked slowly along the line of workers. He did not speak much. He only observed. A nod here. A pause there. A quiet correction when needed. His presence alone was enough to guide the rhythm of the work. Years had taught him that people worked best when they were not hurried. In the shade of a nearby structure, a water carrier sat for a moment with his back against a wooden post. His jars were now nearly empty. He would soon return to the river to refill them. But for now, he allowed himself a few breaths of stillness. He closed his eyes. Listened to the distant sounds of the village. Felt the warmth of the ground beneath him. Even brief rest had its place in the day. Near him, two young apprentices compared small marks they had carved into soft clay tablets. They were learning simple symbols. Nothing complicated. Just enough to understand numbers and lists. One of them had made a mistake, pressing too hard so the symbol became unclear. The other pointed it out gently. They both laughed softly. Then they tried again. Mistakes were not something to fear here. They were simply part of learning. As the afternoon continued its slow journey forward, the entire valley remained wrapped in a quiet balance of work and rest. Fields were tended. Rivers watched. Homes prepared. Tools repaired. Bread cooled. Water flowed. And through it all, the people of ancient Egypt moved together in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. No one spoke of greatness. No one thought of history. There was only the next task. The next hour. The next gentle shift of light across the Nile. And as the sun leaned ever so slightly closer toward the horizon once again, the village continued its calm and ordinary life beneath the endless sky, unaware that this simple, steady way of living would one day be remembered across thousands of years. The afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening once again, softer now, as if the sky itself was becoming tired from holding so much brightness for so long. Across the Nile Valley, everything seemed to move with that same quiet easing. The sharp edges of midday had faded. Colors were no longer harsh or intense. Even the shadows, which had once been small and firm, now stretched gently across the land like they were preparing for rest. In the fields, workers noticed the change without needing to speak about it. A farmer straightened slowly from his work and rested both hands on the handle of his wooden tool. He looked across the rows of grain, watching them ripple slightly in the breeze. The plants were tall now, strong from careful watering and patient tending. He exhaled softly. Not from exhaustion alone, but from a feeling that the day had been long, steady, and complete in its own way. Nearby, his son continued working a little longer. The boy was younger, his strength still growing. He followed the rhythm his father had shown him all morning. Step. Pause. Adjust the soil. Move forward again. There was no rush in his movements. Only learning. The father watched him for a moment before speaking quietly. Just a few simple words. Not instructions. Only reassurance. The boy nodded and continued. In time, his movements became more confident again, as if the land itself was teaching him through repetition and patience. Farther away, along a narrow path leading back toward the village, a group of workers walked together carrying their tools. Their silhouettes lengthened across the ground with every step. The weight of the day now felt different. Not gone, but easier to carry, as if the approach of evening had softened it. One man shifted his bundle of tools to the other's shoulder. Another wiped dust from his face with the back of his hand. A third walked in silence, listening to the sound of their footsteps against the dry earth. They did not need to talk. They had shared the same hours, the same heat, the same quiet effort. That was enough connection for the journey home. At the edge of the river, the water had changed again. It always seemed to do so at this hour. The surface reflected the sky more clearly now, as the sun began to lower. Gold and pale orange colors spread across the water in long, trembling lines. A small group of children sat near the bank, their feet just close enough to feel the cool dampness of the river. One of them picked up a flat stone and tried to skip it across the surface. It bounced once, then sank quietly. The children watched the ripples expand and fade. No one laughed loudly. Only soft amusement passed between them. Another child tried again. This time the stone skipped twice before disappearing beneath the water. A quiet sense of achievement followed, as small and light as the ripples themselves. Nearby, a fisherman pulled his net slowly through the shallows. The net moved through the water like a drifting curtain. He checked it carefully, removing small branches and weeds caught during the day. His hands were slow and practiced. Each movement came from memory rather than thought. The river had taught him everything he needed to know. What to keep. What to release. When to wait. When to move. Behind him, the village was beginning to change its rhythm. Smoke from cooking fires rose more steadily now, curling upward from mudbrick homes as families prepared the evening meal. The scent of bread returned once more, warmer and richer than before. It drifted through narrow lanes, mixing with the smell of river water and sun-warmed earth. Inside one courtyard, a mother placed flat dough onto a clay surface beside a small fire. The heat had softened, making it easier to work. Her children sat nearby, watching closely. One of them leaned forward slightly as the dough was pressed and shaped. He had seen this many times. Yet it still felt important each time. As if the bread being made was part of something larger than just food. Something steady. Something that would return again tomorrow. In another part of the village, a scribe finished his final records of the day. His reed pen moved carefully across the papyrus, adding the last lines of numbers and names. The ink was darker in some places where his hand had pressed more firmly. Lighter where it had not. He paused for a moment and looked over what he had written. Grain accounted for. Tools distributed. Workers listed. Nothing unusual. Everything as expected. He tied the papyrus scroll gently and placed it beside others that had already been completed. Tomorrow would bring a new one. It always did. Outside, the light continued to soften. The sun now rested lower, close to the horizon, casting long golden paths across fields and rooftops. Villagers began to return more fully from their work. Footsteps grew more frequent along the roads. Voices became a little more present. Still calm. Still quiet. But more alive with the thought of home. Children ran ahead of their families, their laughter lighter now that the day's hardest hours had passed. A group of workers passed beneath a row of palm trees, their leaves rustling gently above them like soft whispers welcoming them back. In the distance, the Nile shimmered once more as the evening approached. It carried the reflection of the changing sky, steady and unbroken, as if holding the memory of the entire day within its flow. And as the valley slowly turned toward evening, the ordinary life of ancient Egypt continued its gentle rhythm, where every field tended, every loaf baked, every stone moved, and every quiet step homeward became part of a larger story no one could see while living it. Only the river seemed to understand that this repetition, this calm and patient return of each day, was what kept everything alive beneath the endless Egyptian sky. Ending the history, the last light of the day settles softly over the Nile Valley. It is not sudden. It does not fall all at once. It fades in slow layers, like a quiet breath leaving the world. Gold becomes amber. Amber becomes pale blue. And then, at last, the sky rests into deep evening. Across the village, there is no announcement that something has ended. Only the gentle slowing of movement. Only the return of footsteps toward home. Only the soft closing of another ordinary day. Inside the mud-brick homes, oil lamps are lit one by one. Their small flames do not reach far, but they are enough. Enough to show familiar faces. Enough to warm the corners of a room. Enough to mark the presence of life continuing quietly within the darkness. Families gather as they always have. Bread is broken. Water is shared. Simple meals are eaten without hurry. Voices remain low, as if the night itself asks for gentleness. Outside, the Nile moves as it always has. It does not pause. It does not remember the day in the way people do. It simply continues forward, carrying the reflections of stars across its surface like distant, trembling lights. The fields rest now. The workshops grow silent. The tools lie still where they were placed. And in this stillness, there is no emptiness. Only completion. Only pause. Only the deep, familiar calm of a world that has worked hard and now allows itself to breathe. Somewhere in the darkness, a final breeze passes through the reeds along the riverbank. It moves through the village slowly, touching rooftops, doorways, sleeping courtyards, and quiet streets before disappearing into the open desert beyond. Nothing follows it. Nothing interrupts it. It simply comes, and goes. Above everything, the stars remain. They have seen countless nights like this. Countless mornings that followed. Countless lives that rose with the sun, worked beside the river, and returned again to sleep beneath the same vast sky. And still, they shine without effort. Without change. Without urgency. The village grows quieter. One lamp after another is extinguished. One home after another slips into sleep. Breathing becomes softer. Thought becomes slower. And finally, the entire valley rests as one. Not in silence that feels empty, but in silence that feels complete. The kind of silence that holds fields, rivers, homes, and generations all at once. The Nile continues its gentle flow through the night, carrying everything forward in a way no one needs to control. And ancient Egypt, in all its ordinary beauty, rests once more beneath the endless sky. Not as a monument. Not as a legend. But as a living rhythm of simple days, and quiet nights, where life itself, in its most humble form, was enough. And in that calm, the story softly fades, like the last warmth of the sun leaving the sand, and the world drifting gently into sleep.